In this video, I am going to go over a brief PowerPoint that talks a little bit more about literary criticism and psychoanalysis. First, it's important to know what literary criticism is. Literary criticism is basically the study, analysis, and interpretation, or even sometimes the evaluation of a literary work. So literary criticism is something that we apply to any type of literature, whether it be poetry, playwriting, or short stories, novels, epic poems, things like that. And analytical writing is argumentative in nature. Basically, what you are doing is you are arguing that your interpretation is the correct one, or that it applies to the particular school of criticism that you are focusing on. The purpose of literary criticism is to find meaning in the work, and like I said, also to argue an interpretation or perspective. A lot of literary criticism, what it aims to do is to provide a new interpretation of a literary work. So sometimes you will find some literary criticism comes up with a new way of reading Shakespeare, or comes up with a new interpretation of Shakespeare or Hemingway or anything like that. They come up with a new interpretation that people hadn't really thought of before. So that's the school of literary criticism. When it comes to literary criticism, you can focus on any element of fiction, or you can also focus on the content, structure, implied meaning, the author's personal life and how it applies to the story. You can also sometimes focus on the reader, the effect that the piece of literature has on the reader. And one of the most important things to know about literary criticism is that there are various perspectives or lenses, also known as theories. So when it comes to literary criticism, we don't critically analyze a piece of literature the same way. We can apply a lot of different lenses. So we can look at it through different perspectives. And these perspectives have grown throughout history, and there's a lot of them. Here in the PowerPoint, I have listed a few of them. For example, sometimes you can look at a novel through a feminist perspective, or you can go ahead and look at it through a post-colonial perspective. Of course, not all of these lend themselves to every single text out there, but most literature can be looked at through various lenses or perspectives. Like, for example, you can look at a specific story like The Fun House. The main character is a woman, so there's definitely a lot of issues there that you can interpret from a feminism perspective because of her culture, the way she is treated by people in her reservation. However, we are also looking at it from a psychoanalytic perspective for this class. So as you can see, stories, novels, poems, any type of literature, because they're so complex and they are so rich, they lend themselves to a lot of different types of theories, if you will. The one we are going to focus on, obviously, is psychoanalysis, because this class has to do with identity, so psychoanalysis lends itself a little bit better to that. However, feminism, post-colonial, a lot of these different theories could also apply to identity, because identity is one of those concepts that really apply to pretty much everything. So here we have a few definitions of psychoanalysis, and basically psychoanalysis is based a lot on Freud's theories and a lot of his text and studies. So basically, psychoanalysis argues that there's something unconsciously going on with the character, and such as hidden desires or anxieties, and the literary work is a manifestation of these hidden desires, either of the author or mostly of the author or the character. But for this assignment, the case study, we're not really looking at the author's own unconscious or neurosis. We are focusing on the character and only the character. So another way to look at it is that we are looking at the actions and words as manifestations of what's going on inside the character's heads. So in other words, we're looking at the character, and based on the actions that occurred throughout the story, we are trying to figure out what's going on in their head based on what we've seen in terms of actions, interactions, quotes, things like that. This is probably the part of the PowerPoint that mostly applies to you, and that is probably the most helpful. What I went ahead and compiled here is I compiled some terms that I got from one of the websites that I listed. Here you can see the websites right there. Some of the websites that I listed in the module, in the psychoanalysis module, I compiled some of those terms and I provided a definition, and I also went ahead and applied them to one of the stories we have read to sort of make it easier for you. So the first term is the abject or objection, and this one has to do with our reaction, usually in horror, to a threatened breakdown, in meaning caused by the loss of a distinction between subject and object, or between self and other. So this one I thought definitely applied to the narrator of the Telltale Heart, because he reacts in horror to the evil eye of the old man. We also have death drive, which this one is basically an instinct to return to the state of quiescence that preceded our birth. So it's sort of what the term means, death drive. There's this this desire to go back to die, and obviously we see this with Seymour's behavior in suicide. However, I think that you might also be able to apply it to Gregor, since there is this sense of he just gives up and dies because he didn't really have anything else to live for, since his family was not very nice to him. So death drive could possibly be also applied to Gregor. We also have displacement, which is basically to feel displaced, to feel out of place, but it is also by one of the methods by which the repressed returns in hidden ways. So sometimes when you're trying to repress something, you feel displaced. And this, I felt, really applies to Seymour, since he comes back and there's definitely some repression there, but he also feels out of place. And I also went ahead and included Mrs. Dawes, because she's repressing a secret, and I do feel like she feels like she doesn't really belong in her family. Now, all of these are my opinion of how they apply to the character. Feel free to add more characters to the list if you'd like, or also if you don't think Mrs. Dawes applies to displacement, that's perfectly fine. This is all about interpretation. So if you don't agree with this, that's perfectly fine. If you think there's another character who fits into a certain term and I didn't include him or her in this list, then by all means, you go ahead and in your essay apply that term to him or her. Then we also have the gaze. This is the uncanny sense that the object of our eyes look or glance is somehow looking back at us. This one is definitely the Telltale Heart. The narrator, as you can see, a lot of these apply to him because he's one of those characters that just has a lot of things wrong with him, but this obviously applies to him and the eye. We also have narcissism, which is another psychological term, and this one is excessive self-love, and this one I think applies to D, to Muriel and Mrs. Dawes. We haven't read Everyday Use yet, but D is one of the characters from that story, and I believe that narcissism applies to her. However, like I said before, feel free to disagree. Moving on, in the final slide is we have psychosis, which is a mental condition whereby the patient completely loses touch with reality. Again, we have the Telltale Heart, narrator Seymour, and I included Sammy in this one because throughout the beginning of the story, he's sort of off in his own mind. He's off in La La Land. He's very descriptive. He's very observant. So he kind of gets lost in that. So that's why I went ahead and I included him in there. Again, I think it's a stretch, but I just included him in there because I think you can make an argument that it applies to him. Then we have regression, which is the psychic reversion to childhood desires, and I think that that is definitely Seymour. That could explain his relationship with Sybil and just his desire to be around children and going back to that innocence of childhood. Then we have repression, which is the rejection from consciousness of painful, disagreeable ideas, memories, feelings, or impulses. And for this, I have Mrs. Dawes, Seymour, Glenn Baxter, and Victor. I think that all of them are definitely repressing something. Now, Glenn Baxter, I know he's not a main character, but I think that this applies to him more so than it applies to Les. So if you're writing about Les, you can definitely go ahead and include Glenn Baxter in there as some sort of influence. And if you think that part of Glenn Baxter's repression had a negative effect on Les, then you can go ahead and include that. Then we have the three main terms that Freud is most known for. And the first one is the id. The id is the part of the personality that contains our primitive impulses, such as thirst, anger, hunger, and the desire for instant gratification or release. Because there's this desire of instant gratification, I thought of the boys in Light is Like Water. They definitely were not the type to wait or to think things logically. They just had this desire for going back to their homeland. Again, we haven't read Light is Like Water, but in case you want to jump ahead, the id would apply to the boys. And I also included Bub from Cathedral because I think he was one of those people who definitely give in to his primitive impulses. He did not know about patience or compassion or anything like that, so I think the id would apply to him. Then we have the superego, which is the part of the personality that represents the conscience, the moral part of us. The superego develops due to the moral and ethical restraints placed on us by our caregivers. I think that this definitely applies to Sammy because I think that one of the reasons he quit was because he didn't feel that the way the girls were treated was right. So I think that applies to him. We also have the narrator from The Telltale Heart, believe it or not. I think that this applies to him. Again, this could be, you could definitely disagree with this, but I think it could apply to him because he definitely feels that what he did was justified. So it's almost like he feels that he did the right thing by killing the evil eye since the eye was evil. Then finally, we have the ego, which is the part of the personality that maintains a balance between our impulses, our id, and our conscience, our superego. The ego is based on the reality principle. The ego understands that other people have needs and desires, and that sometimes being impulsive or selfish can hurt us in the end. So I think that this relates to Bub. He eventually realizes this. Also Robert and Sammy. So as you can see, this is just a short example of some of the terms. Obviously, you can go to those websites that I linked in the module and you can use other terms in your essay. I just included some to kind of give you an idea, and then I also applied it to some of the characters, but again, feel free to use more terms. Feel free to apply these terms to other characters. This just serves as an example. And keep in mind that, again, this essay, you don't have to do a lot of research in terms of the psychological terms and things like that. It is a case study. You do have to use the psychoanalysis theory, but we're using it at a very basic level. We are basically being introduced to it. So don't feel like you have to go above and beyond and, look at all these psychology books and things like that. So if you want to use the terms from this PowerPoint and that's it, go ahead. If you have a little bit of background on this, then by all means go ahead and utilize that knowledge. But like I said, you need to use a psychoanalysis theory in your essay, but again, we're using it at a very basic level. So I hope this PowerPoint was helpful. If you have any questions regarding the essay, the course, or psychoanalysis theory in general, please email me, or if you'd like to meet, I would be more than happy to meet with you. Thank you.